Welcome back. The panel is with us. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Casey Hunt. Hugh Hewitt, host on the Salem Radio Network. O.K. Henderson, news director of the Radio Iowa Network. And Michael Eric Dyson of Vanderbilt University, author of Long Time Coming, Reckoning with Race in America. President Trump, folks, is still insisting that he won the election. However, which of course he did not, and that Joe Biden did not win 80 million votes. He has. And that the election was somehow marred by massive fraud. It was not. But last week, he did seem to put to rest the idea that he would refuse to leave the White House on January 20th. Take a listen.
If the Electoral College does elect President-elect Joe Biden, are you not going to leave this building?
Just so you, certainly I will. Certainly I will. And you know that. But I think that there will be a lot of things happening between now and the 20th of January.
Kay Henderson, you're the one not stuck on the with the rest of us coastal elites. And I guess Michael Eric Dyson gets to be no longer as a coastal elite when he heads over to Vanderbilt from Georgetown. So as our middle, literally in the geographic middle of this country, what do Americans hear when they've been hearing the president complain about this election?
Well, not everyone is hearing that, number one. Number two, in terms of a concession, in the state of Iowa, Jim Ross Lightfoot has still not conceded the 1998 election to Tom Vilsack. Tom Vilsack still went on to serve 2 terms as governor and both terms as President Obama's U.S. Ag Secretary. So therefore, I think that when historians look at this period, they're likely going to look at the policies that were discussed and debated during this period, and perhaps what Trump may or may not be able to do with Congress in relation to pandemic relief.
You know, Casey Hunt, this is not new with this president. He has complained about whatever has happened, whether it's a bankruptcy. Here in 1990, he's always claiming that somehow what we're reading or what we're hearing is not true. In 1990, whether it's a marriage or whether it's financial, I've never seen press reporting as I have with regard to me. I hope the general public understands how inherently dishonest the press in this country is. We had a Type C personality running the hotel. I've never made money in my life with a Type C personality. These lenders are babies. These are total killers. Every company virtually in Atlantic City went bankrupt, every company. There's always an excuse and there's always a reason. There's never a point where he admits the facts on the ground. Again, this is not just his political career, his business career, and his celebrity career.
Well, and he's spent most of the time in all of those careers trying to avoid the label of loser. And in this particular case, it's very clear he lost the election to Joe Biden. He lost it in a significant way. And that's something that he cannot escape, despite trying every avenue to the point of absurdity over the course of the last couple of weeks since the election was actually declared. And you're right. I mean, and in Iowa, remember, I don't think he's even conceded that he lost the Iowa caucus to Ted Cruz in 2016 when he was first running for the Republican primary nomination. And this is something that clearly, for him, he's spent the entirety of his presidency attacking the media, and he's been pretty transparent about why he does that. He says, right. Well, the reason I do that is because that way, when they say something I don't like, no one will believe them. And, that's the question here that I think history is also going to reflect on. How much damage was done to trust in our systems, in our institutions, in our elections during this period when an outgoing president was trying to do everything he could to convince his supporters that the results couldn't be trusted?
Hugh Hewitt, your listeners, they don't want to believe the facts that are on the ground. Do you feel like you confront your listeners enough that don't want to believe the facts, or do you think you could do more?
Oh, every day I talk to people who believe that there's massive fraud in Georgia, and I tell them no, and they've got to get out and vote for David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, who I support. But I think what's going on is an undervaluation of the voters' intelligence again. They're very sophisticated. They know President Trump is, as of today, planning on running for election in 2024 against President-elect Biden. And he's doing things consistent with that. And I think he is going to spend the next 4 years underscoring the big successes of his tenure, including Operation Warp Speed. It was great news what Dr. Fauci said, that most of the frontline people will be vaccinated by the end of December. He's going to emphasize his military rebuild, the Supreme Court. He's going to emphasize conservative realism versus the Chinese Communist Party, and the Abraham Accords. So he's just setting up a campaign that's already begun, and I wouldn't be surprised, Chuck, if on or before the inauguration of President Biden, he announces Trump 2024 is formed, and it's off to the races.
I would look, he announced his reelection campaign on Inauguration Day in 2017. Michael Eric Dyson, the damage, President Trump is using old dog whistles to talk about voter fraud. He's talking about the cities. And I guess we should be glad he's only using a dog whistle when he says the cities. Long-term damage that's being redone here, in your mind?
Well, it's pretty unparalleled. A sitting president of the United States of America attacking with such vitriol and viciousness the very process of democracy that landed him the job to begin with. So while he undercuts the prospects of American democracy, he's undercutting his own legitimacy, the very thing about which he has been obsessed over these years. But think about the dog whistle that in some instances has been far louder. Look at, he's attacking Detroit. 79% black. He's attacking Atlanta, 52% black. He's attacking Philadelphia, 42% black. He's attacking Milwaukee, 39% black. So we get what he's doing here. He's trying to have his cake and eat it too, so to speak. He has an uptick in voting among African American people, about 5%. Among black men, 4% among black women, and yet at the same time he wants to be able to whistle to white supremacists and white nationalists that he is still their guy and that he will continue to send out the notion that somehow this is a fraud. The fraud is related to race. Race is itself illegitimate, and as a result of that, you as a white person have every reason in the world, regardless of your stratification, whether you're making $100 million a year or whether you're barely making $10,000, to vote for me because I'm your guy. This is destructive to the process of American democracy and one of the most powerful repudiations of enlightenment. Here's a guy who's anti-science, he's anti-race, he's anti-everything that makes this country, it seems, the very great thing he wants to make it.
Kay, this issue of, we're hearing basically two different sets of facts, two different narratives. How does that come? Where do you see it the most in Iowa, and where do you see it on the ground in your job?
Well, frankly, I'm not seeing that much. The Iowa Republican Party State Central Committee passed a resolution a couple of weeks ago saying that they support President Trump's pursuing avenues through the courts all the way to the Supreme Court. You have Republican voices like the chairman of the Republican Party here in Iowa still supporting the president. You don't hear a lot of talk among Republicans about the voter fraud issue. We do have an election here that is still ongoing. There's a congressional race here which currently has a Republican in the lead by 6 votes. And it's likely that this will also be going through the court system. So you don't hear those talking points here as much because of the vote counting that's still ongoing in Iowa's 2nd congressional district.
I tell you, Kay, I'd love to go. We could go real deep on that 2nd congressional district. To think they went from Dave Loebsack to possibly where they're going to go today, it just sort of tells you everything about the changing dynamics, not only around the country, but in Iowa as well. Anyway, when we come back, while Joe Biden held socially distant campaign events, President Trump hosted huge campaign rallies. Did they help or hurt? Data download is next. Hello from Washington, I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.